All right, friends, time for the hands-free drive to work. You know you can keep your hands on the wheel and at the very same time have a conversation about steering yourself through the weeds of work. This morning, we want to continue talking about how to decide differently. We said you'll never act differently until you learn how to decide differently, and you'll never decide differently until you learn how to think differently. And so first we set out to think differently. We want to make sure that we realize as we steer ourselves through the weeds of work, the thing that's guiding us is not necessarily profits and incentives, but it's a met need. And if we learn to find the need and meet the need, then that's where profits and incentives come behind. But it's always important to make sure that we keep our focus and steer ourselves by that met need, because a met need necessarily comes before any profits or incentives that come back to us. And then we think differently before we act differently, because we know there's times when we knew exactly what to do, we knew exactly how to think, yet we didn't choose to act. And so we have to learn how to decide differently. And we said the way to do that is to develop these new character traits, because James March taught us that we decide from identity. We decide from our identity. So we're kind of doing some reverse engineering. We're saying, okay, James, you taught us how we decide. We thought we did it more rationally with a pros and cons list, but you're telling us we actually did it. We actually do it with our identity. And so we're just trying to build a new identity. And we've talked about a couple of those character traits that make up a new identity, just like H2O makes up water, and water has properties and it always acts like water. Now we know that we always act like ourselves, and we always choose like we do. Casey always chooses like Casey does. So if I'm going to change Casey's decisions, I have to make sure I change who Casey is, his identity, the core traits that make him up. And we've talked about a couple of those. We talked about grit. We talked about gentleness. And today we're to one other of these character traits that I love, and it's pretty obvious, really. If you're going to be a great self-manager, you're going to lead yourself or steer yourself, one of the character traits you have to learn to develop, one of the things that you have to develop is self-control. Self-control is a trait that we must have if we're going to be excellent self-managers, and we know that you'll never learn how to manage or lead others until you first learn how to lead yourself. So let's think about how we develop. Let's use the 3 E's this morning to think about how do we develop the character trait of self-control. First, we need it explained. Remember that? First, we have to explain self-control. And so self-control, I really believe this is why there's not a lot of material on the shelf right now about self-management or self-leadership, because a necessary part of self-management or leadership is self-control. But one of our greatest ideals in our country, in our culture, one of the greatest ideals that we really hold highly as a virtue is freedom. Freedom we see sometimes as just a lack of rules, a lack of any kind of controls. And so if we're saying that you have to have self-control to be a great self-leader, it's probably why we don't see a lot of material on the subject, is because we love freedom so much. But listen, this is a myth. To understand self-control, to have it explained, we have to understand that absolute freedom is really a myth. It's not something that we actually adhere to. Absolute freedom, the absence of rules, is not really freedom, because freedom is not the absence of rules. It's aligning with your purpose. That's the difference. Because we know this. If you want to have the freedom of healthy lifestyle, we know this. You have to take on the control or the yoke. You know what a yoke is. It's what they put on like horses or oxen whenever they were pulling a load. They'd put that yoke on them. And so we know that to do that, to have the freedom of retirement, we have to take on the yoke or the self-control of savings. To have the freedom of a healthy lifestyle, we have to take on the yoke or the self-control of correct eating habits or exercise habits. We know that what we're really saying when we have freedom is that we get to choose what controls us. You remember that's what David Foster Wallace said. He said, you don't get to choose what you worship. You don't get to choose if you worship, You only get to choose what you worship, says David Foster Wallace. In the same way, if we want freedom, we don't get to choose if we are controlled by something, or if we limit ourselves in some way, we actually have to make sure we have to do that if we want to have the freedom that comes along with controlling ourselves in some ways. We just get to choose what those things are. Does that make sense to you? We have to choose our limits. And when we choose our limits, what we're really trying to do is trying to act with the purpose that we were made. You think about this. You would never say to a bird in the air, you're free to go swim under the water. Why? Because it couldn't live under the water. There's no freedom there. It can't be free while it's diving under the water. It can only be free when it's acting with its purpose. It's self-controlled enough to stay out of the water, because there it'll die. And so really for us, it's really self-control is trying to find the limits that create freedom. It's trying to find the limits that create freedom in our lives. So that's self-control. Freedom's not the absence of rules. Freedom is trying to choose your limits in a way that brings about the most freedom, that's in accordance, in parallel with your actual purpose. So that's self-control explained. Self-control explained is choosing how to limit yourself so that you can be free in all the areas that you want to be free in. And so that's self-control. The next thing we have to do, we have to have an example of self-control. Listen, I love this example, and this really, it fires me up and it inspires me. So I'll give you this example. There's a civil rights attorney, Bryan Stevenson. There's a movie called Just Mercy out now. I read the book a while ago, but in the book, there's an example that Bryan Stevenson talks about, and he doesn't say it's an example of self-control, but when you hear it, you'll know this is a massive example of self-control that we can see in somebody else when they've learned to limit themselves in certain ways so they can be free in other ways. This is a great example. Bryan Stevenson goes into a prison, and he's there to represent a young man who's mentally handicapped. And he knows if he gets the meeting with this young man that he can talk with him before the court case. And so he goes, and outside there is a huge truck with big tires and a massive rebel flag hanging outside of this truck. And so when he goes in, he notices the truck, and it's kind of a obvious sign that of racism. And so he walks into the jail, and the person who's letting him through the door tells him, the jailer says, we're going to have to subject you to a search. And Bryan Stevenson says, I'm an attorney. I don't have to go through a search to be able to come in. And the guy says to him, did you see that truck outside? And Bryan Stevenson, of course, says yes. He said, well, that's my truck. And he said, if you want to go in this jail, then you're going to have to go through a strip search. And Bryan Stevenson, man, when he tells this story, you can just tell there's such a heaviness to it. And at the same time, he tells it with such poise that is so inspiring. And so Bryan Stevenson, in a great act of self-control, he didn't have to submit himself to the search. In no way, shape, or form was he supposed to go through the search, but so he could get to Avery, the young man who he's representing, he limited himself. He went through a strip search so he could go in and be able to meet the needs of Avery, the client that he was there to serve. Is that incredible? That's an incredible act of self-control. And Bryan Stevenson, listen to what happened and I know this doesn't happen every time. Every time we use self-control, we're not going to see this great, miraculous thing happen. But listen to what could happen. Bryan Stevenson went in, he represented Avery, then he went to the courthouse, and that same jailer was there at the courthouse, and he watched Bryan Stevenson stand up and represent Avery well. He watched how inspiring it was that Avery really was imprisoned falsely. He was really only there because he couldn't afford any representation and he had a mental deficiency. And so that jailer was moved by how Bryan Stevenson stood up for this young man, Avery, and actually represented him well. So Bryan Stevenson goes back to the jail the next time. And when he gets there, the jailer says, Mr. Stevenson, come on in. And Bryan Stevenson looks at him and he's almost confused that it's the same person. And he says, I saw what you did for Avery. He said, I saw what you did for Avery, and I'm sorry. See, Brian Stevenson's act of self-control actually moved the jailer to now act differently. The jailer was developing, as he saw this example of self-control, the jailer was now developing a new identity. Do you see this? He was developing a new identity that he could act from. And I'm like, man, this is beautiful. So when you see this, when you see this kind of self-control displayed, it makes us want to go out and be able to really limit ourselves in some areas so that we can meet the needs of those around us. And I told you the last one's experienced. And a lot of times this is where it really brings the power. Because yes, Brian Stevenson is a great example. But Brian Stevenson didn't do that for me. And so I'm inspired by it, but a lot of times when we remember times when we've experienced someone else displaying self-control for me, it brings power into that interaction where we can actually move out and do it ourselves. And I'll tell you, for me, really, really quickly, one of the times in my life where I was most confused, I began to meet on a weekly basis with my buddy Levi. Levi, I hope you watch this. Levi would sit down with me and we would go through the scriptures, and he understood the scriptures, and I told him I'm confused by a few things. I'm not really being able to put some of these things together. And actually I began to argue with him when he would try to correct what I was confused about. I said I was confused, and then I argued whenever he tried to correct what I was confused about. But then over and over again, I watched him show up to the same meeting, and he would listen to me, and I would kind of argue back, and we'd have the same argument over and over again. And really, he displayed a lot of self-control on my behalf. He never got frustrated with me. He just continued to describe this same concept over and over and over again, until one day I realized, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I missed this. And it became so clear. But now I think about how much self-control, when I'm trying to explain someone a difficult concept, and over again they continue to argue with me, and then they say, well, I'm confused, but then they keep arguing with me. It can rise up some of the weeds of work. One of the weeds of work is frustration. So if you know you're explaining something correctly to someone and they continue to say, well, I don't think you understand, it can make you frustrated enough that you want to stop trying to meet their needs. But if you are able to take on the yoke of self-control so that you can have the freedom to meet that need. See, when I experience that from Levi, now when I start to move out and do that for other people, it gives me the power to remember that. I'll say, I know this person, I'm tempted to be frustrated from this person arguing back with me, but I remember that's what, when I argue back with Levi, he continued to show grace to me and continue to show up and invest and teach. And so then I say, okay, I know I feel that frustration rise up, but I want to steer myself well through the weeds of work, and I want to display self-control for this person, just like self-control was displayed for me. Do you see that power? And you have your own experiences. You have times when somebody has specifically displayed self-control on your behalf. So think about today as you steer yourself through the weeds of work, as we try to develop this character trait of self-control. Think about, one, just what self-control is. It's choosing your yoke. It's choosing where you're going to limit yourself. Then remember the example of Brian Stevenson, and think about a way somebody has displayed self-control on your behalf. And if you remember a good one, drop it in the comments. And like I said, we'll learn from each other. Hands-free drive to work. Thank you for listening this morning. Have a great day.